It's Wednesday, August 13th, and Tropical Storm Erin will likely become the first major hurricane of the 2025 hurricane season. And currently, Erin is still a fairly weak tropical storm moving westward at about 20 to 25 miles an hour, and it will likely stay in this tropical storm state all the way up until Friday this week, and we won't really see any major intensification until the weekend. Now, it is likely to become at least a major hurricane per the National Hurricane Center by Sunday this weekend. And some more good news about the track is that the trend that it will go towards the Atlantic Ocean and possibly miss the United States altogether is definitely on the uptrend. And we can see here on our ensembles that we definitely have a very, very large group of ensembles moving towards that fish storm Atlantic type of deal, and we don't really have any actually in this model run at least going towards the United States. Now there is still a very, very small chance of that happening, but it's looking extremely unlikely. But I wouldn't say that we know for sure all the way up until this weekend. Now, one place that might want to look out is Bermuda. A lot of these ensembles do steer Erin towards Bermuda, and it says that it could likely be a major hurricane at that time. So definitely something to stay weather aware of if you know anybody in Bermuda or are in Bermuda. And then we also have a fairly isolated risk of severe weather today up here in the northern plains, specifically with the greatest risk being in southern South Dakota. That will be a slight risk, then also a associated marginal risk, which pretty much spans the rest of South Dakota and even the far northern part of Nebraska and the far southern part of North Dakota. And I do think we could see some strong storms in the desert Southwest and also pretty much anywhere out here in the east, with a focus in the northeastern region, specifically anywhere north of the Virginia, North Carolina border. And today's threat is mostly going to be fueled by the risk of some strong damaging gust. I wouldn't be surprised to see some 70-mile-an-hour wind gust in our slight risk area. Then also in the rest of our marginal risk area, there's just that conditional threat for some 60-mile-an-hour gust. And our hail risk is actually going to be pretty small, but also isolated to pretty much the entire state of South Dakota. We aren't really expecting to see anything more than 1 to 1.5 inch hail today. And then there is also a small tornado risk for possibly a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes along our line of thunderstorms. So there is actually a risk for all hazards of severe weather out here in the northern plains today. And then we are actually expecting to see some widespread potential for some flash flooding. Although the risk for that is going to be super large, we will see that in all of our marginal risk, one being up here in the northern plains, another one being down here in the desert Southwest. Then pretty much everywhere east of the Great Plains, excluding the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, there is going to be the widespread potential for 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. And actually in the Smoky Mountains, we do have a small isolated slight risk for potentially 2 to 4 inches of rainfall. And then today we could see a lot of above average temperatures, specifically in the Gulf Coast states, with that maximum being in Florida and also far eastern Texas and western Louisiana. We could see some low to mid 100s feels like temperatures in those areas today. Now, other areas which are going to see a warm up from previous days is going to be pretty much the entire Great Plains, seen around some mid 90s feels like temperatures, and then also the entire eastern coast of the US could also see some mid 90s feels like temperatures as well. And then the Pacific coast, which has been seeing some above average temperatures, will likely to continue to see that, although they won't be as extreme and they'll likely only be in that low to mid 90s feels like temperatures region today. And then here's what the radar will look like as we go into today. In our main risk area up here in the northern plains, we could see some storm initiation along the South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana border, likely around the mid-afternoon hours. And then our greatest cluster of storms would be likely in central South Dakota along a potential outflow boundary left behind by a mesoscale convective vortex. Now, this doesn't really have the potential to redevelop, but if it were to redevelop in the earlier hours, this mesoscale convective vortex in front of our main line of storms could actually hamper the environment quite a bit, but currently it's not really expected to do that, and the probability of that happening is fairly low. But our main cluster of storms is likely going to evolve pretty quickly into a strong linear segment, and then we're going to see that maximized potential for all hazards of severe weather. So some spin-up tornadoes and the highest wind gusts are also going to be along that outflow boundary, and then we're also just going to see that conditional threat for some hail and gusty winds pretty much all the way through our line. And then this line would likely fall apart in the nightfall hours today. And other things helping to initiate this would be the geography, where the upper plains meet the Great Plains, and then also a trough pushing through, and also a bit of a weak dry line behind this as well. And then in the desert southwest, there is once again the potential for some strong storms. The probability of these being severe is not super high, but there is a very small chance. And the main threat with these would likely be some gusty winds in that 60 mile an hour. And then in the northeast, I also do think there is a pretty high potential for seeing some strong storms today. Also, not really severe like we saw in the southwest, but this is actually going to be helped by a cold front from yesterday, then also a glancing blow by a trough. And the further south we go, the risk of seeing some strong to potentially severe storms will likely decrease quite a bit, because there's not just going to be the ingredients that we're seeing north of the North Carolina and Virginia border, but I definitely do think we could still see some strong clusters down here in the mid-Atlantic and southeast today. And then here are 500 millibar winds, and we can see that glancing blow by a trough up here in the northeast, possibly bringing some strong storms with a probability of them being severe, not being super high. Then we'll also see a bit of flow or a short wave pushing through our main risk area up here in the northern plains, also helping to initiate our storms and also bringing some organizing shear to them as well. Then we also have a high pressure system in the desert southwest, possibly bringing some organizing shear to these storms, which are expected down here, then also to our main cluster up in the northern plains. Then we also see some remnant flow down here in parts of the mid-Atlantic and southeast, which is another reason why I do think we could see some potentially strong storms, but not really severe out there today. Then here is the storm environment in front of our main cluster in the northern plains, potentially bringing that threat of all hazards of severe weather. And we can see one of the reasons for that all hazards threat is going to be a bit of a curve in our photograph. So although our shear and helicity is going to be pretty low, our shear vectors themselves are actually going to be somewhat parallel to our line of storms, which does have a knack to increase some areas of spin-up vorticity and also a couple of spin-up tornadoes. Then we also see quite a bit of organizing shear around 40 knots. So definitely some organized strong storm clusters out here today. Then also some wind veering helping to accomplish that same task. Now, one of the things possibly hampering our tornado threat and why it's extremely conditional at the moment is a extremely high cloud base that is expected. This would likely be lowered substantially around that outflow boundary, and also on that outflow boundary we could see some greater shear. But also another thing which these big lines of thunderstorms do, they extend their cloud tops in front of them, which also tends to lower the cloud base in front of them. So I definitely do think there will still be a conditional threat for tornadoes, but it would likely only be isolated to the part of the cluster which is on the outflow boundary. Then for our other risk, first damaging winds, we do see that we have a very high downdraft cape nearing 1700 and also a relatively low relative humidity coupled with a decently high precipitable water, 1.53. So all things which would support that threat of some damaging winds and also some significant damaging winds nearing that 70-mile-an-hour gust territory. Other things are going to be a pretty moist environment for this region specifically, and elevation at around a 56 dew point. So whenever we see high 50s, definitely the risk of severe weather is elevated. Then also a modestly unstable environment at around 2200 Cape. So just favorable for severe weather in general. And then one of the reasons why our hail risk isn't super high, despite our pretty high organizing shear, our really high mid-level lapse rates, is going to be a mostly linear storm mode. And there's also just not tons of cape up here near our freezing level, which is also super high. But normally that wouldn't matter if we saw a more discrete mode, but it's likely just going to be a very linear mode, so that threat of hail is going to be diminished substantially. And then for all of our other risk areas, which I'm not showing a weather sounding for, it's just going to be a somewhat moist and unstable environment, which allows for the conditional threat of some severe storms, likely only being strong though.